What does intelligent charity look like? Hi, welcome to today's little lesson, and thank you so very much for joining me once again as we continue our verse-by-verse journey through the book of Acts. And if you're with me on the previous two little lessons, you know that they were special episodes that I filmed while I was in Southern Africa. Two lessons that I had a chance to film in Malawi, Southern Africa, as I was there for 2 weeks, not just in Malawi, but also in Zimbabwe and Uganda. Uganda would technically be East Africa. Malawi and Zimbabwe would be Southern Africa, technically. In any case, I was checking up with a few other staff members from Heaven's Family on some projects that we've had going there for a number of years, focusing primarily on the impact of Heaven's Family's Farming God's Way ministry. And we heard the testimonies of scores and scores of formerly failing subsistence farmers who are now succeeding because they're applying the agricultural methods, the revolutionary agricultural methods of farming God's way. We can promise them that if they will follow them, the very next harvest will be 3 times what it ever was historically in their same plot of land. And lots of them are applying it. And so for the first time in their lives, they're no longer going through a hunger season every year. That's when last year's crop, that they stored up runs out. And they have to wait for this year's harvest to have something to eat again. They've eliminated the hunger season. And now they have discretionary income for the first time in their lives. And so it's an absolutely beautiful thing to see in action. And it all starts with people like you who care and give to Heaven's Family's Farming God's Way ministry. Okay, so anyways, I talked about all that. There's a wonderful spiritual component, because we're utilizing it to plant simple churches, house churches. And in Malawi, for example, our main partner that we've been working with for years, they've got 80 house churches planted through Farming God's Way. All right, so I hope you'll check that out at Heaven's Family's website. Now, anyways, on our previous lesson, I kind of left you with the impression that we were done with the first 7 verses of Acts chapter 6, but we're not really done, in part because I was inspired a bit to go back and dig some more good, helpful nuggets out of the text here. And just to refresh your memory, these first few verses of Acts chapter 6 talk about a problem that surfaced in the early church. Let me read it from verse number 1 so we don't make any mistakes. Now, at this time, while the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews, that would be the Greek Jews, against the native Hebrews, the Israelite Jews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So this is a little tense, because obviously, irrefutable that the early church was very much involved in caring for widows. But we've got two ethnicities represented in Jerusalem, at least two, and we have Hellenistic Jews and we have the native Hebrew Jews. And the Hellenistic Jews, the Greek Jews, are saying, hey, our widows aren't benefiting from the ministry to widows here. And so, the apostles talk about it, and they get the disciples together, and they say, pick 7 men, and the 7 men are listed there. Now, I want to talk in this little lesson about intelligent charity, because it's a lot of charity done by well-meaning people, but it's not intelligent. Because they're not taking in consideration all of the factors, and ultimately they hurt the very people that they're trying to help. And I have experience in that myself, so I can't point the finger, of condemnation towards anybody else. When we first started the ministry of Heaven's Family about 21 years ago, we were quite naive and thought that helping the poor was, simple. And, it just requires money and compassion. Well, it actually requires money, compassion, and it requires intelligence, people who will take their time to take in consideration all of the factors, that have some part to play in the situation as well as in the solution. Because you can, for example, dump rice in the port of a major African city, thinking you're doing a wonderful thing by helping all the people who don't have any rice because of the recent flooding or whatever, or the recent drought. And maybe on the surface it seems like a good thing, but all the people who were selling rice, everyone who had a business that had something to do with rice production and rice transportation and rice selling, you put all those people out of business. And then when the free rice runs out, they're starting from square one, because there's nobody. You put everyone else out of business by your charity, and you don't just well-meaning people don't just hurt other parties. Sometimes they wind up hurting the very people they're trying to help, and we can describe situations that involve that. But here's something that I want to show you that is a bit of wisdom. A real bit of wisdom that's often overlooked in this. When they chose these 7 men who were full of men of good reputation, and let's see, what does he say? Full of the Spirit and of wisdom. Now, those were 3 very important components in the selection of the 7 men who were going to administrate, obviously, what was a pretty significant ministry in providing a daily meal for widows who were apparently destitute. And the 7 men that were chosen, if you research their names, they're all names of Greek origin. And so the congregation that chose these 7 men had the wisdom to put interested parties, so it wouldn't look like, oh, we're going to just take native Israelite men and put them in charge of making sure the Greek widows are not overlooked. No, we're going to take Greek origin people, and they are going to have responsibility. So it's always wisdom to get people who are close to the situation and who are very interested in making sure that the outcomes are good outcomes. Sometimes when you get people who are a distance from the actual problem and who aren't as interested as they would be if they were related to the people who were being helped or were neighbors to the people who were being helped, then, it's the quality of the ministry. The outcomes are not nearly as good. So we want to involve people who are close to the problem, and we want to involve people who care about have a vested interest in caring about the outcomes. And that's one of the great flaws of trying to help people through Facebook, who become your friend on Facebook and say, I have this problem, and you send them money. And you don't even know if they're a criminal or not. And I'll tell you, many of them are. And they prey on well-meaning, compassionate people like me and like you who want to care for the poor, and they take advantage of the fact that we can't be there. We're not going to buy a plane ticket and go and see. And even if you do buy a plane ticket and go and see, they're going to set you up because they know you're going to be there just a very short time. And then they can pretend anything they want to pretend while you're there. And then when you hop back on your plane, everything goes back to normal and the money starts once again going into their pockets. And so you want to utilize the services of somebody who's on the ground all the time and who's of good reputation. And those are hard to find, let me tell you, people of good reputation who are full of the Holy Spirit and full of wisdom. The Ministry of Heaven's Family has waded through a lot of people who prove themselves untrustworthy. Let me tell you, and any ministry that's worked overseas, any people that work overseas often become very jaded and disenchanted because of the amount of people that line up who appear to be trustworthy at first, but who have ulterior motives. And so you're fighting a very losing battle to be connecting with people on Facebook, let me tell you, and trusting them as you send them money by Western Union. Big mistake. That's not intelligent charity at all. That's really not intelligent charity. Okay, so if you're not going to go, you need to find someone who's going to go, but you have to have relationships with people on the ground who are there all the time. And you have to have trustworthy people, and that's very difficult. Now, we all ought to be helping widows. This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father. James wrote to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world, by the world. So this is part and parcel of following Jesus. And what's amazing is that it's completely off the radar of not just most professing Christians, but most professing Christian leaders. When's the last time you heard a sermon about caring for widows and orphans in your church from a sermon from your pastor? Probably never. Part of the reason, of course, and I think God gives grace for this, is because if you're living in a wealthy country, the widows are not out begging on the streets, and neither are orphans in that case, because there are social programs sponsored by the government and so on. And so, it's not in our face. But that doesn't make us less responsible to be caring for the widows and orphans around the world who are members of our spiritual family, but it makes it more difficult. So I just heard, actually just 2 days ago, somebody was kind of bragging on somebody else, a Christian artist, a worship guy who's a great guy, and he's made some money with his music over the years, and single-handedly he's supporting an orphanage somewhere, I think it was in India, where there's 260 orphans, and he's paying for them all himself, and as if that's a good thing. Well, that's a terrible thing. Terrible thing. And you say, well, don't you think he's ever visited that orphanage? Oh, he probably has, and they probably love him at that orphanage. But God did not design for children to be in orphanages. And again, I know all about this because at one time Heaven's Family was supporting a lot of orphanages in a number of countries. And then we found out eventually that most of the children in there are not orphans at all. They have at least one living, most of them two living parents, and the parents are very poor. And by supporting the orphanage, we created a market for a boarding school so parents could send their children to a boarding school that in many cases is hundreds of miles away from their families. And they are raised in an environment where they have no conception of a family, and so they're ill-prepared as adults to have families of their own because they've always been with these mobs of kids. They've always been crying out for the attention that all children need from their parents, and they can't get that in an orphanage of 262 children, for crying out loud. No Christian should be supporting an orphanage. Did I say that plain enough? Okay. The nation of Australia, on a federal level, has banned what they've termed orphanage tourism. That is, Australian people going to orphanages in Asia, mostly Southeast Asia, for visits, mission trips, and so forth, to love on those kids and to feel good about themselves, and then to create attachment problems because those kids latch on to anyone who will show them any attention, and then you leave, and maybe you don't come back for another year, maybe you never come back. And so we're trying to help these kids. We're actually hurting these kids. Maybe you say, oh, it's so wonderful because they feel my love while I'm there. Wonderful. What do they feel when you're gone? And how did they turn out as adults? But in my orphanage that I support, one of the children who was there for 15 years, now he's a doctor. Yeah. Well, that's scientific evidence that every kid becomes a doctor. And how is that one that became a doctor doing? How's his family? How's his marriage? How's he doing at raising his kids? Because he never was part of a family because of your kindness and generosity to send $30 a month to that orphanage. You see, I'm talking about intelligent charity, and here's the first little bit of information we get here. I've drifted from that subject, but it's an important drift. They're using wisdom. They're putting people in charge of it who one of the three qualifications is they have to be full of wisdom because this is complex. This is complicated. And we could create more problems than we solve if we don't do this the right way. And I'm going to talk about that more in relationship to widows. Okay. So anyways, we don't get the details here in precisely all the details of the administration of it. But years later, of course, taking care of widows is still a part of what the church does. That's what Christians do. It's in the Bible. And so Paul writes to Timothy, his first letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 5. There are about 16 verses there. There's about 13 verses there where Paul lays out specific wise direction about ministry to widows. But the first thing that happens, the first thing you need wisdom is as soon as you start caring for one group of people, there's going to be another group of people who are going to say, hey, we're equally as deserving. It's not fair. And so you always deal with those fairness issues, and you have to have some kind of delineating line, that determines who receives the charity and who does not. And you can be sure that the people who are just a little bit below that line of delineation aren't going to like it, and you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to need wisdom. Okay, that always exists when you start caring for the poor. There are people who think they deserve it just as much. And so you have to have some criteria as to who you help. Well, you should not be helping orphanages because you're creating a market for parents to want to give their kids to an orphanage, quote unquote orphanage. They're not really orphanages, they're mostly boarding schools. This is universally true around the world. And you say, well, I asked the director about my orphanage, are these all orphans? And he said, yes. Well, then it must be true. Now, he makes his living from his orphanage. A percentage of everything you send supports his family. Do you notice that his kids are going to college? How's that possible? You see, did you notice that the sign over the orphanage is in English, but that's not the language that everybody speaks every day? Why is the sign in English? Because they want the English visitors to identify this is an orphanage, when in reality it's a boarding school. And it's an industry in some nations. We used to work in Burma, better known, not better known, but the actual name of the country is Myanmar, and is an orphanage industry in Myanmar. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of orphanages. And if you are a young Christian man who feels called to the ministry and you go to a Bible school, one thing they'll teach you at the Bible school is when you graduate, you should do three things. Number one, start a church. Number two, start a Bible school. Number three, start an orphanage. That's how to succeed in ministry. And the orphanage thing, of course, is a money thing. So aren't there any pure-hearted? Probably many of them are pure-hearted, these orphanage directors, but they themselves have to be educated and they don't have the wisdom to realize we are disintegrating families, we are destroying lives because we're raising kids in an environment that God never wanted them to be raised in. There's always parents, there's always relatives, there's always somebody who would take a child into their family. True Christians, would do that if there are any true Christians in their country. All right. So get out of the orphanage industry if you're into it. Stop sending money to the orphanages and tell them, no, children belong in families. And so if you really care about these kids that you say you care about, you'll be making efforts to get them into Christian families, preferably their own families if it's possible. If not, close relatives who are Christians. If you really cared about kids, that's what you would be doing. Okay. So, intelligent charity for widows. Now, let's just begin reading what Paul wrote to Timothy, because Timothy has to care for the widows, and we need wisdom. And probably by this time, this is a criteria that had been established, I would suspect, across the board in all the churches, but all of Paul's churches at least. He said, honor widows who are widows indeed. So there are some that should be honored, and if you read the context of this, you realize it means supported. And there's some widows that should not be supported. What's the criteria? But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. So the widows shouldn't be taken care of from the general fund of the church, as it were, when in fact those widows have children or grandchildren who could be taking care of them. And can you see, if the church supports them and the children and the grandchildren find out, then they're disincentivized to care for people whom God expects them to care for. See, you're not helping, you're hurting. You think we're helping these widows. No. You're hurting these widows because you're destroying the relationship that they would have with their children and grandchildren who ought to be taking care of them rather than the church. And so right off the bat, Paul is saying, only help widows who are widows indeed. That is, those who have no one else to care for them. Like, for example, their children are dead, or their children are far away, or their children are unbelievers and they don't care, that type of thing. The church should only be taking care of widows who don't have someone else who can care for them. And that would be the only justification for an orphanage. If there was no one else in the country to care for them, no other families. If we ask every family, then it's okay to have an orphanage. Now, the criteria goes on to support widows. We're not supporting characterless widows. Alleged Christian widows who taking a handout and living a life of lazy, non-productivity. Listen to this. Now, she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. The only widows that you should be supporting are those who are devoted to the Lord Jesus Christ. And if they can do nothing else, although many of them can, they are women of prayer. Isn't that amazing? That Paul is telling Timothy, don't be just giving handouts to widows who are just, living a carnal life, living for their own selfish ends and so forth. No, only support widows who are devoted to Jesus Christ. And here comes the contrast. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. What he's saying is, if she's professing to be a Christian, she's not a Christian. She's spiritually dead. And how do you know that? Because she gives herself to wanton pleasure. She's not devoted to prayer, entreaties and prayers, night and day, as a widow who has no other responsibility. She's got no children to take care of, no husband to take care of. She just has to take care of herself, And so she got the time to spend a lot of time in prayer. But if she doesn't, and she's just living for her own selfish ends, she's dead even while she lives. She's spiritually dead. We're not to be supporting non-believing widows. Well, there's a lot of wisdom in this. You see, because when you give money to non-believers to help them out, you can do more damage than you can actually do good. And I'm not saying never to help non-believers. All I'm saying is that, do you understand the concept here? Help widows who can't make a living, but they can pray and they can show their love for Jesus Christ. If you help an unbeliever, well, they're just going to say thank you and stick their hand out for more because you just enable me to continue to live in wanton pleasure. The same Paul writes in another place, if any man will not work, neither let him eat. So we're supposed to let lazy people go hungry until their hunger drives them to get a job or to offer to work for somebody for pay. And if you want to help a poor person, don't give them money, give them a job where they can earn money, even if it's only for a day. That's better because what you're teaching them is, how do we get money? We work for it. We don't get money by appearing poor and by telling a hard luck story. The way you get money is you serve someone else. And it's a fair exchange. It's not you work and I eat. It's I work so I can eat. Paul says to Timothy, prescribe these things as well so that they may be above reproach. So if any man will not work, neither let him eat. If any widow is not praying and devoted to God, don't support her. But if anyone does not provide for his own, he returns to the former theme, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So remember, he said a few sentences earlier that widows who have, children or grandchildren who could support them, the church shouldn't be supporting them, from the general fund, as it were, for lack of a better way of saying it. Their own kids or grandkids should be supporting them. And now he says, he's already talked about widows who, are dead while they're alive. Now he's talking about other people who are dead, spiritually dead. That is, how do you know if you're a Christian? Well, if you're not caring for, if you've got if your mother's a widow, or if your grandmother's a widow and she has no support, she's destitute. If you don't help her, you have denied the faith and you're worse than an unbeliever. Does that sound like you're going to go to heaven? No, I don't think so. No, because Christians, followers of Christ, follow Christ. And we're supposed to be involved, every Christian is supposed to be involved in caring for the poor, the biblically poor, those without food or covering. Every Christian should be involved in that on some level. So if you've got people in your own family who are that poor and you're not caring for them, and if you think you're a Christian, you're only fooling yourself. You have denied the faith. What you're saying is, I am an unbeliever, as indicated by my actions. I'm worse than an unbeliever because even unbelievers have this much love that they care for their, if their mother or their grandmother is a widow and she's destitute. She has no food or covering. Unbelievers will care to that degree. But can you see how helping, sometimes people want to help can hurt, because if the church supports these people, then that relieves the responsibility of the children, the grandchildren to do something. Oh, well, the church is taking care of it. See, I'm talking about intelligent charity. Intelligent charity. All right, well, we're out of time for today. I hope this has been a blessing to you. On our next little lesson, we'll pick up right here. I just want to continue to look at the requirements that Paul enumerates here of the kind of widows to help. And this should be guiding us in who we help across the board. Right? Okay, something to think about that most people have never thought about before. Now, if you want to help widows, Heaven's Family, a ministry that I started 21 years ago now, has a specific focus. 14 different focuses or foci, and one of them is widows and abandoned women. And I just got back from Uganda, where I heard the testimonies of scores of abandoned women and widows whom Heaven's Family has helped on some level to get them started in a small business, to build them a little house so they have a place to stay and so forth, and partnering with local churches who are also doing what they can, to care for those widows. And You can go to heavensfamily.org and look for widows and abandoned women, and you'll see testimonies there and opportunities to help widows in very poor nations. Okay, so there you go. You can get involved with, and we're working with people that we trust who are on the ground, who have a vested interest in seeing those widows actually help. They're trying to help those widows themselves. That's that's the beautiful thing about it. Okay, all right. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, may the Lord continue to bless you.